At the United Nations General Assembly, India has said that political convenience cannot determine a country's response to terrorism. The statement did not name Canada, but was a clear reference to it. I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo Story. Our continued focus on this big global story here on Mojo Story throws up the question, what might happen next? Canada has also referenced what it calls foreign interference at the United Nations without naming India. But later, speaking at the Council on Foreign Relations, India's Foreign Minister Jaishankar confirmed that Canada has shown no specific evidence to India. Jaishankar once again underlined that India has raised several times concerns around organized crime, terror groups, and secessionist groups operating with impunity out of Canada. As this becomes a global issue, in between the India and Canada collision, how might the United States respond? For this and more, let's go across to Canada today, where we're joined by somebody who has been a very, very keenly followed voice on this conflict, and it is now a conflict. I'm joined by Vivek Dehejia. He's a strategic affairs expert, also a professor and an author. It's good to see you, Vivek, after a long time. Let me start by asking you whether you ever thought the day would come when India would make a veiled reference to Canada at the United Nations General Assembly. That is something that used to be the case on India's relations with Pakistan. But increasingly, the language India is using for Canada, including safe haven for terrorists, is the language it is typically reserved for Pakistan. What's going on?
Thanks, Barkha. Great to be on the show and great to see you again after several years. It's an absolutely extraordinary situation. It's been a little more than a week. I could never possibly imagine something like this happening, really all stemming from Prime Minister Trudeau's decision to make these explosive allegations without evidence, but with the claim that there was credible evidence, which he didn't share in the Parliament. May I also remind your viewers, on the first day of the fall session of Parliament after the summer recess. So it was quite an extraordinary moment. And of course, we saw what happened after the tit-for-tat expulsions, the travel advisory, India stopping visas for all Canadians, an extraordinary step. And what we saw at the UN, as you say, sort of the without naming, sort of shaming without naming, as it were. No, I could, although relations had been very poor, you might recall, and I think we spoke at that time, Trudeau's 2018 sort of disastrous gaffe-ridden visit to India, which was more of a Bollywood trunk show than it was a state visit in any meaningful sense, with a convicted terrorist or convicted attempted murderer, Khalistani extremist, being invited by the High Commission to the Prime Minister's reception. That was sort of the final serious gaffe in a very long series of gaffes throughout that whole visit. And may I also, remind you of your viewers, this has been a terribly bad week for Mr. Trudeau. Just this past weekend, on the eve of Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, a Nazi was honored in the Parliament of Canada because someone didn't realize, and there was an absolute failure of due diligence here, that, if someone's CV says, I fought against the Russians in World War II, it means that he fought on behalf of the Nazis. Because now we think Russia is the enemy and so on in the West. But in World War II, post-1941, Russia was an ally of the US, UK, Canada. So, if this kind of a basic error is made, and the Speaker of the House resigned today, he was thrown under the bus, Mr. Trudeau has never accepted responsibility for any mistakes. He made a very cryptic statement, a very strange statement, saying that Parliament is embarrassed. Quite odd, because Parliament is not an individual that can be embarrassed, and nor did he apologize. So I think this is sort of the wheels coming off the Trudeau government at this point. He's tanking in the polls. He's grasping at straws. So was I surprised? Yes. Should I have been? Perhaps not so much.
Yeah. Suggest that Trudeau has basically disassociated himself conveniently from the decision to call this gentleman to the Canadian Parliament. But Indians are looking at this and saying, if you can't even vet who's speaking in your parliament, can you really vet intelligence on the basis of which you're claiming a hit job by India of a terrorist?
That's a very fair question. And again, look, the allegations are very serious. And if true, I mean, India has a lot to explain. Having said that, the way one deals with friends and allies, and Canada's foreign policy document, Indo-Pacific Strategy, so-called, says India is an important new ally, a democratic counterweight to China in the region, and so on. So this is not how you deal with a friend. This is how you deal with a rogue state like North Korea. The real problem here is not so much the substance of the allegations. That can be handled through back channels, and whether it's true or not, we don't know. We've seen no evidence, not a shred of evidence. But the way it was done, very, very publicly, for many people in Canada, it appeared that Trudeau was trying desperately to change the conversation. He's sinking in the polls. He's made serious gaffes. Now, within the space of a few months, both China and India have become enemies of Canada, or in conflict with Canada, whatever word you want to use. So, he's about 1/3 of humanity is now not sympathetic to Canada. This Indo-Pacific strategy is in tatters. So it's been handled very, very poorly. And it's quite hard to know, really, at this point, what he could do. And the trade agreement is dead. The trade negotiations have been going on for almost 15 years, are dead in the water, DOA. So that is finished. So where does Trudeau go from here? That's a very interesting question.
I'm just processing what you just said. 1/3 of humanity has turned against Trudeau. Between India and China, he's literally got two major powers covered there. I just want to play out a small clip for you. This is a small clip of what Jaishankar, speaking at the Council on Foreign Relations, says when questioned about this allegation and whether Canada has provided any evidence. Listen in.
Share with you very, very frankly what we told the Canadians. One, we told the Canadians that this is not the government of India's policy. Two, we told the Canadians saying that, look, if you have something specific, if you have something relevant, let us know. We are open to looking at it.
Now, implicit in that, Vivek, is that there's nothing been shown yet. Yet, Canada, through media leaks, suggests that behind closed doors, India was confronted with this allegation and so on. The Washington Post in the last 24 hours reports on a video that it doesn't actually broadcast. At least I have not seen this video, but it talks about this dramatic chase, a coordinated hit on Hardeep Singh Nijjar, and references a video. We already know that the intelligence that the Canadians are claiming is human in signals, which means that they were, that the Indian diplomats were put under surveillance. But beyond that, we don't know much.
True. And here's the thing, Barkha. As you said correctly, all of the information that we have are in the form of leaks from Canada, obviously, and possibly from the US about the so-called human intel, the signals intel. But again, we have not seen it. India says that they have not seen this evidence. We just saw that in the clip as well. So what is one supposed to make of it? Again, I go back to the basic point that if you're standing up, if the prime minister of a country is rising in parliament on the first day of the fall session of parliament after the long summer recess and accuses the world's largest democracy and supposedly an ally of a heinous crime such as this, an extraterritorial judicial assassination or quasi-judicial assassination, whatever word you want to use, it's a very serious matter. And how can one take that sort of at face value without any evidence in the public domain, again, apart from these leaks to Western media houses to whom Canada and possibly the US has leaked information? It's a very bizarre situation, Barkha.
Let's talk a little bit about the geopolitics of this, how this is going to impact other relationships, other alliances, the Western alliance in particular. You have the American ambassador to Canada going on record to say that some of the intelligence did come from the Five Eyes grouping. In other words, some of it came from the US. You have Tony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, using a phrase, a kind of awkward phrase, condemning transnational repression. What there is a division in perception on, at least in India, is this rhetorical standing with Canada while behind the scenes something else is going on? Because we also know that Trudeau wanted to bring this up before or during the G20 and was prevailed upon by the Americans, by the British, to not do it, to not sabotage the G20. Where do you see the Americans? You have everybody from Michael Rubin, who used to be at the Pentagon, saying, look, America is going to stand by India unless the US Congress gets involved, right? And today you have provocative statements from an Ilhan Omar. You must have seen that. How do you see the United States responding?
No, this is a very interesting question, Barkha. And I must say my view on this is shifting a bit. So my original view, and I wrote an op-ed in the National Post here in Canada over the weekend, saying that, look, Canada is isolated. The US has been very, very muted and equivocal in its response. They've expressed serious concerns. That diplomatic speak for saying, we acknowledge it, but we're not going to do anything about it, did not condemn India. But then, given what the ambassador here said, and the fact that possibly some information has been leaked by the Americans, you have to start wondering whether the Americans and Mr. Biden is playing something of a double game here. That on the one hand, the U.S. is trying to cozy up to India as the world's largest democracy, the fastest growing major economy in the world. Of course, we know Mr. Modi's state visit, and Mr. Biden will be a guest in India next year, and so on. So all of that's on the record. But again, sources can be wrong, suggest that perhaps the U.S. might have goaded Canada a bit into taking this action. So
why might he be playing this double game? Why might Biden? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I'm curious. This phrase you used, and a lot of Indians are wondering also about what you just raised. Why might Biden be playing a double game? Because given the Quad, given India's need, given the American need to leverage, quite honestly, India as a countervailing force to China, given the sort of ups in the relationship recently, how fulsome Biden was with his praise for Prime Minister Modi during the G20, and so on. Why might Biden be playing what you call a possible double game?
Well, this is a matter now of speculation. Partly it could be that Biden is in part captive to the left wing of his party, and you referred to Ilhan Omar. The left wing of his party there are many strongly anti-India voices in that grouping, and of course, let's be honest, Biden is a very weak leader. So we may not be exactly sure where this kind of impetus is coming from. Is it from Biden? Is it from Hillary Clinton? Is it from someone within the administration? Biden is not exactly someone that one sees as a strong leader. And on foreign policy, he's been sort of all over the map, as we've seen over the last couple of years. So, but it's an interesting question, and it doesn't make sense at some level why Biden would want to potentially scupper this burgeoning friendship with India. And already in India, one is your voices saying, look, how can we trust the Americans if this is how they operate? So it's playing into a kind of a nativist, U.S. suspicious narrative in India, which, by the way, let me also remind your viewers, is not just the right wing, but the left for years. I mean, the communists, the left parties for years said, we cannot trust America. So this is not something that's sort of a partisan thing in India. And unfortunately, what's coming out of Washington gives Indians reasons to be a little skeptical of how sincere Biden is. And again, how could that possibly make sense, given that the U.S., and again, I should say that this has been a bipartisan thing. Trump assiduously courted Modi, and they had the several summits. There was obviously sort of a bonhomie between them. Obviously, less so between Biden and Modi, although there's the superficially the friendly sort of rapport. But I think in the U.S., both major parties agree that India is a top priority. So why is this going on? Why are the Americans possibly playing this double game? Again, we don't know. It could reflect, as I suggest, perhaps Biden's reliance on the left wing of his party, perhaps the fact that he himself has a weak grip on his party, and he's now facing this major budget crisis.
But you are convinced that this sort of double game, as you call it, is not mere rhetoric, that the Americans are sending out mixed messages on this issue?
I think it's hard to escape that conclusion, Barkha, at this point. I mean, given that enough now, more than a week has elapsed, and you are hearing, again, different messaging, that we are concerned, and we stand with our allies in Canada, but they have not condemned India. But then, yet they also leaked this information. Their ambassador here in Canada says, yes, the intelligence came from us. Now, obviously, he only did that with the approval of the State Department and the U.S. administration. So I find that very strange. Why are we getting this information sort of in dribs and drabs, as it were? Why does no one actually say, look, this is what we have? Given that the allegation was made so publicly, I think it's now incumbent on Canada and the U.S. to share what they have. And do they have a smoking gun? If they did, I reckon that they would have shared that with us already. So I don't. So I'm very skeptical of the notion of a smoking gun out there. But if there is, why don't they share it with us?
Yeah. Let me ask you in the end, I think what really galls a lot of Indians, and this is, by the way, irrespective of which side you vote, one of the most viral speeches on this issue has actually come from a Congress member of Parliament whose grandfather was assassinated by Khalistanis, right? And I think that's what a lot of people don't get outside India. They make it all about sort of the domestic politics of India and whether you're for or against Prime Minister Modi. This is not that issue for Indians. This is an issue about India and terrorism, and it's just grating to see a lot of the West not getting that. Now, here's my fundamental question. Why is there so much ignorance about Kanishka bombing, the fact that 329 people died on board, many of them were Canadian citizens? We've been talking to the families of the victims of the Air India bombing, and they talk about this massive cover-up, one man only sent to jail for this horrific mass death, the 9/11, before 9/11 existed, of the aviation world. That man also, the only man convicted, is also released earlier on parole. Today, you have a Nijjar who's being described as a plumber, as a community leader in sections of the Western press. And you have Jagmeet Singh, who's an ally of Trudeau, basically sort of, threatening to hold Prime Minister Modi personally accountable for Nijjar's killing. And in Punjab, you have a Pew survey that confirms that 95% of Sikhs surveyed identify as both proud Punjabis and proud Indians, 93% and 95%. What's going on? I mean, if there's such a large community of Punjabis in Canada, how can Canada, the press, be so ignorant of the difference between being a proud Sikh and being a fringe extremist Khalistani?
Well, this is a very complex question, and I think the simplest way I can explain it is that in Canada, as in several Western countries, diaspora grievances have gotten sort of cemented in. In Canada, so as you correctly, the Khalistan movement is dead in India, essentially. But somehow in Canada, but also to some extent in the US, UK, Australia, but Canada has the largest number of Sikhs outside India. It has been a festering wound. The Air India bombing, as you referred to, the worst incident of terrorism in the history of Canada, botched investigation, most of the culprits not brought to justice, and yet many Canadians simply don't know this. But I think, more broadly, Canadians, or people in general in the West, are terribly ignorant of history. I'm a professor and I teach, and I was casually asking my students, who were the combatants in World War II? Who were the Allies and who was the Axis? They had no idea. And, and perhaps this explains.
Well, clearly, nor did the Speaker's office in the Canadian
Exactly.
Parliament, which is how an advocate to speak.
Commons and his office know, and the Speaker resigned today. Mr. Trudeau threw him under the bus, refusing to take personal responsibility. So it's extraordinary. If you don't know who was on which side in World War II, how would you expect them to know anything about the history of Khalistani extremism in Canada? This is the TikTok generation, and they don't know much beyond what happened, a few hours ago. But it's really, really sad that Mr. Trudeau and the people around him, and Chrystia Freeland, Deputy PM of Ukrainian heritage, proudly Ukrainian heritage, fluently speaks the language and has spent time in Ukraine. Of course, she was formerly a senior journalist, as you know, at Reuters and Financial Times, other places. Obviously, she must have, how could she not know about the Ukrainian Waffen SS unit? So there's some fundamental dysfunction in the Trudeau government. And again, it's maybe sort of the end game for them. They're tanking in the polls.
I was seeing today the opposition was taking him on now on Canadian Muslim citizens. So he seems to have a controversy a day.
Well, he does, and he is, as I said, alienated 1/3 of humanity, alienated all Jewish Canadians and Jewish friends around the world, that too on the eve of Yom Kippur. I mean, the worst possible, something that was the worst thing that could happen, the worst possible timing on the eve of the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. So, essentially the wheels are coming off, his administration. It's now only a question of whether he decides to jump or whether he's pushed by his own cabinet because they want to try to salvage what's left of the remaining 2 years in office. And will he be statesmanlike and say, look, it's time, I've had my innings, it's time to go. Let someone else take the helm and try to salvage what's left of our term in office. Otherwise, it's looking pretty grim for Mr. Trudeau at this point.
Very briefly, before we let you go, given the fact that you think the Americans are also possibly sending mixed messages, that takes them out of the picture then for being mediator behind the scenes, or does it not? What do you think happens next?
A really good question. So I do think that it would be hard for the U.S. to play this honest broker role, given the leaks and given that the fact that their ambassador here has said, yes, we provided the intel, at least some of the intel, whether the signal or the human intel, we're not quite sure, but the Five Eyes ally was the U.S. How could they play honest broker in that situation? And Canada, let's not forget, is one of the oldest allies of the United States, going back to the First World War, if not before. So I don't think India would accept at this point the U.S. as sort of the honest broker negotiator. And I'm not sure quite who that could be. Perhaps a European country that hasn't taken a strong position on this. But what is there to negotiate? At the moment, according to India, no evidence has been shown. The world hasn't seen the evidence. Mr. Trudeau claims he has, presumably, what he thinks is a smoking gun, else he wouldn't have stood up in Parliament. So it's a very, very bad situation. I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. India stopped visas. Will Canada stop visas? I don't think they will, because 40% of the foreign students here from India, they pay the fat, full foreign student fees that fill the coffers of the university, including the university where I teach, for example. So it's just spiraling down, and it's really not the only question is, when will we hit bottom? And honestly, no one really knows.
Yeah. And at the moment, bottom doesn't seem very, very far off. Thank you, Vivek. It's been a fascinating conversation. We'll have you back as this story shifts. The story can't hold for too long in this pattern. Something has to give, as you said. So very interesting. Thank you, Vivek, and take care.
Thank you, Barkha. My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.